They say every bride is beautiful on her wedding day, but for wedding planner Susan Mitchell in Charleston, South Carolina, the bride walking down the aisle at Magnolia Plantation looked like someone she'd been dreaming about for 28 years. The young woman in the flowing white gown had no idea that the woman coordinating her perfect day was the birth mother who had kissed her goodbye as a newborn and spent nearly 3 decades wondering if she'd made the right choice. What started as another elegant Charleston wedding was about to become the most emotional day of Susan's professional career, as she watched her daughter marry the love of her life without ever knowing that her birth mother was making sure every detail was perfect. Susan Mitchell had built Charleston's most prestigious wedding planning business over 15 years, specializing in the kind of elegant Southern ceremonies that graced the pages of Southern Living and Martha Stewart weddings. At 50, she was known throughout the Lowcountry for her attention to detail, her calm demeanor under pressure, and her ability to make every bride feel like the most important woman in the world. What her clients didn't know was that Susan's dedication to creating perfect wedding days was driven by her own deep longing for family moments she'd never experienced. 28 years earlier, Susan had been Susan Elizabeth Harper, a 22-year-old college senior at the College of Charleston. She'd been studying art history and dreaming of a career in museum curation when she'd fallen in love with James Morrison, a charming graduate student from a prominent Charleston family. Their relationship had been passionate but complicated. James was engaged to someone else, a debutante from a family that matched his social status perfectly. When Susan discovered she was pregnant, James made it clear that he couldn't leave his fiancée and that Susan was on her own. The pregnancy had forced Susan to drop out of college just months before graduation. Her own family, middle-class folks from Columbia, were devastated by what they saw as their daughter's ruined future. With no support system and no financial resources, Susan had made the heart-wrenching decision to place her daughter for adoption. She'd chosen a couple through an agency in Charleston, William and Catherine Roberts, both lawyers who'd been trying to have children for years. The adoption had been closed, but Susan had learned that the couple planned to name her daughter Emma Catherine Roberts. For 28 years, Susan had carried that name in her heart, wondering what Emma looked like, whether she was happy, if she ever thought about the young woman who'd given birth to her. Susan had never tried to contact Emma, respecting the closed adoption agreement, but she'd never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, she might know how her daughter's story had unfolded. Susan's path to wedding planning had been accidental but felt destined. After the adoption, she'd worked various jobs around Charleston, eventually landing a position at a high-end catering company. Her natural organizational skills and eye for beauty had led to opportunities in event planning, and eventually, she'd started her own business. Every wedding she planned became a celebration of the family connections she'd missed in her own life, and she threw herself into creating perfect days for other people's daughters. In March 2024, Susan received an inquiry that seemed routine: a June wedding at Magnolia Plantation for a couple named Emma Roberts and Michael Davidson. The bride's mother, Catherine Roberts, contacted Susan personally, explaining that this was her only daughter's wedding and that money was no object in creating the perfect day. Catherine mentioned that Emma was a teacher, that she was kind and intelligent, and that the family wanted a classic Southern celebration that would honor their Charleston heritage. Susan was immediately drawn to the project. Magnolia Plantation was one of her favorite venues, and the June date gave them plenty of time to plan something truly spectacular. During their first meeting at Susan's downtown office, Catherine Roberts impressed Susan with her warmth and obvious love for her daughter. She showed Susan photos of Emma, a beautiful young woman with dark hair, green eyes, and a smile that seemed familiar in a way Susan couldn't place. The wedding planning process unfolded over 3 months, with Susan working closely with Catherine to design every detail. They chose white hydrangeas and magnolia blossoms for the flowers, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a reception menu featuring low-country classics. Catherine spoke constantly about Emma's preferences, her personality, her excitement about marrying Michael, who was a doctor at MUSC. The more Susan heard about Emma, the more she found herself invested in making this wedding absolutely perfect. 2 weeks before the wedding, Susan finally met Emma in person for the final venue walkthrough. The young woman who walked into the plantation's bridal suite took Susan's breath away. Emma Roberts was stunning, but it wasn't just her beauty that stopped Susan. It was the unmistakable resemblance to Susan's own grandmother, and the face Susan saw in old photographs of herself at that age. Emma had Susan's green eyes, her delicate bone structure, and a way of moving that was eerily familiar. During the walkthrough, Susan found herself studying Emma's mannerisms, her laugh, the way she gestured when she talked. When Emma mentioned that she taught 4th grade and loved working with children, Susan's heart clenched. When Emma showed concern for making sure her adoptive parents felt honored during the ceremony, Susan nearly dropped her clipboard. "You're adopted?" Susan asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Yes," Emma said with a warm smile. "Mom and Dad adopted me as a baby. They've always been completely open about it, and I've never felt like anything but their beloved daughter. I actually think about my birth mother sometimes, especially on days like this. I hope she knows that her difficult decision led to a wonderful life." Susan excused herself to the bathroom, where she sat on a chair and tried to process what was happening. Emma Catherine Roberts, the right name, the right age, adopted in Charleston by lawyer parents. The resemblance was unmistakable now that Susan was looking for it. This was her daughter, the baby she'd given birth to 28 years ago, and Susan was planning her wedding. The remaining 2 weeks were an emotional roller coaster for Susan. She threw herself into making Emma's wedding absolutely perfect, working 14-hour days to ensure every detail was flawless. Part of her wanted to approach Emma, to reveal the connection, but a larger part knew that Emma's wedding day belonged to Emma and her family. Susan could give her daughter the gift of a perfect wedding without disrupting her life. Susan also found herself researching the Roberts family more thoroughly. Catherine and William Roberts had indeed been successful lawyers, now retired. They'd raised Emma in a beautiful home in the historic district, sent her to private schools, and clearly loved her deeply. Emma had graduated from USC with a teaching degree and had been teaching in Charleston's public schools for 6 years. Everything Susan learned confirmed that her decision to place Emma for adoption had given her daughter the life Susan had hoped for. The wedding day arrived with typical Charleston weather, warm, humid, with the threat of afternoon thunderstorms. Susan arrived at Magnolia Plantation at dawn to oversee setup, but for once, her professional focus was secondary to her emotional state. Today, she would watch her daughter get married, celebrate Emma's happiness, and then return to her life carrying this secret. Emma arrived for photos looking radiant in a classic silk gown that perfectly suited her personality and the venue. Susan stayed in the background, coordinating vendors and managing timeline, but found herself stealing glances at her daughter throughout the morning. During the first look photos with Michael, Emma's joy was so pure and genuine that Susan had to step away to compose herself. The ceremony was everything Susan had envisioned: elegant, romantic, and deeply meaningful. As Emma walked down the aisle on William Roberts' arm, Susan stood at the back of the seated area, ostensibly monitoring for any issues, but really just watching her daughter take one of the most important steps of her life. When Emma and Michael exchanged vows they'd written themselves, speaking about love, family, and building a life together, Susan quietly cried behind her sunglasses. The reception was flawless, the food was perfect, the band kept everyone dancing, and the flowers looked like something from a magazine. Susan managed every detail while watching Emma celebrate with friends and family. During the father-daughter dance, Susan observed the obvious love between Emma and William Roberts and felt grateful rather than resentful. This man had been the father Susan couldn't be, and Emma clearly adored him. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Susan was packing up her coordination materials when Catherine Roberts approached her. "Susan, I can't thank you enough for making today so perfect." Emma was absolutely glowing, and everything was exactly what we dreamed of. "It was my pleasure," Susan replied honestly. "Emma is obviously a very special young woman. You and William raised her beautifully." Catherine smiled, then said something that nearly made Susan's knees buckle. "We were so lucky to adopt her. Her birth mother made an incredibly selfless decision, and I've always hoped that somehow she knows how grateful we are." Emma turned out to be everything we dreamed of and more. Susan managed to thank Catherine and finish packing. But as she drove home that night, she finally allowed herself to cry fully. She'd watched her daughter marry a wonderful man, surrounded by family and friends who clearly loved her. Emma was happy, successful, and cherished. Everything Susan had hoped for when she'd made the difficult decision to place her for adoption. 6 months later, Susan made a decision that had been building since the wedding day. She contacted the adoption agency that had handled Emma's placement, requesting information about current procedures for birth parent contact. She learned that adult adoptees and birth parents could now register their interest in contact, and if both parties registered, meetings could be facilitated. Susan registered her interest and wrote a letter explaining who she was and that she'd been Emma's wedding planner. She shared her contact information and made it clear that she respected Emma's right to privacy, but wanted Emma to know that her birth mother was proud of the woman she'd become and grateful to the Roberts family for raising her with such love. 3 weeks later, Susan received a call that changed everything. Emma had been registered in the system for 2 years, hoping to find her birth mother. When the agency contacted her about Susan's letter, Emma immediately requested a meeting. The young woman who'd wondered about her birth mother was thrilled to learn that she'd been so close to her during one of the most important days of her life. Their reunion took place at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston, with a social worker present to facilitate. Emma arrived with photo albums from her childhood and wedding photos, eager to share her life story with the woman who'd given her life. Susan brought letters she'd written to Emma over the years but never sent, and photos of her own life and career. The conversation revealed that they'd been living parallel lives in Charleston for years. Emma had eaten at restaurants where Susan had planned events. They'd shopped at the same stores, visited the same parks, and even attended some of the same cultural events. The city that had brought them together through the adoption had kept them connected in ways neither had realized. Today, Susan and Emma have built a beautiful relationship that honors both Susan's role as birth mother and the loving family who raised Emma. Catherine and William Roberts welcomed Susan into their extended family, understanding that love multiplies rather than divides. Emma often jokes that having Susan plan her wedding was the universe's way of making sure her birth mother was part of her special day, even when neither of them knew it. Susan continues to plan weddings throughout Charleston, but now she has a daughter to share her successes with. Emma and Michael recently welcomed their first child, making Susan a grandmother and giving her the family moments she'd dreamed about for 28 years. The baby's nursery features flowers from Emma's wedding bouquet, preserved and framed as a reminder of the day that brought mother and daughter back together. Sometimes the most meaningful work we do happens without our knowing it. Have you ever discovered that you touched someone's life in ways you never realized? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible true stories about family, love, and the mysterious ways our lives intersect. Next week, we'll share the story of a family dinner that turned into a disaster when DNA results revealed a 32-year secret that changed everything the family thought they knew about themselves.